Take this job and shove it. I ain't working here no more. Come in.
Hey Daniel, me and LG been debating what is the greatest music video of all time. I said it's Michael Jackson's Thriller, but
No way.
well, what do you think it is?
It's Guns N' Roses, November Rain, baby. It's got 1 billion hits on YouTube. This ain't no electoral college win, baby. This is popular vote. Let me show you. It's got 3 guitar solos, Slash standing on a piano, standing out in the rain, a guy jumping into a wedding cake, Slash not needing an amp or anything to be plugged in outside. Cinematic genius in a 9-minute song.
You know, I'm just going to say that is not the first air guitar that Daniel has played. All right, you could tell that was the actions of a seasoned veteran. All right, so he knows what he's doing. But hey, church, how we doing this morning? Good. Man, we're so glad you're here. And over at Lagodi, man, we're glad that you guys made it to join us this morning. As a matter of fact, can we give a round of applause just to welcome them, let them know we're glad they're here? Absolutely. And I know that over in Lagodi, man, you guys are coming off of an incredible week. You guys just had your Amped. That's our kids ministry VBS week. And man, it was awesome. I got to spend some time over there and kind of watch what you guys were doing. And I know at Jasper, we had that just a couple of weeks ago. And I just want to say, man, our kids ministry is incredible. All right. Amanda and Miranda, they did an awesome job. All of our kids ministry volunteers, man, they absolutely killed it this last week. And so, man, we were so lucky, so blessed to have them just pouring into our kids. And I would encourage you, if you're looking for somewhere to serve, that is a ministry you should want to be a part of, all right? They're having huge impact, doing big things. And so, man, I just love to look at what God is doing there. So I'd encourage you, if you're not already, man, check that out. It's a good place to get plugged in, okay? But this morning, we are continuing in a series that we've been in for a few weeks, all right? It's called GOAT, and it's not about farm animals, all right? GOAT stands for the greatest of all time. And it's used as sort of like a sports term. It can refer to the greatest athlete of all time. So we talk about, like Michael Jordan versus LeBron James. And we know that Jordan is the true GOAT, right? You can use it to refer to music, as we just saw on the screens, little video that played before. The greatest band of all time, the greatest music video of all time. But that's not what we're talking about, all right? We're talking about something a little different. But before I get to that, I do want to clear something up. I know a lot of you, because this has kind of stirred up some great conversation just in the last few weeks in our office. And I know several of you have commented to me about the conversation that Daryl and I had about basketball. All right, so I just want you to know, all right, when you're wondering who is the greatest college basketball program of all time, all you have to do is look at who has the most wins. And that would be my Kentucky Wildcats, all right? That's the greatest college basketball program of all time. I got some cheers, some people that know what's up, all right? But, and also, it's just too much fun. I can't help but mess with you a little bit, so I love doing that. But in our series, we aren't talking about that. We are talking about what is the greatest commandment of all time. All right? When it comes to what Jesus has called us to, what God has asked us to do in our lives, the way that we are called to live, at the very core of what that is, what is the most important thing that we should do? And put as simply as we could make it, Jesus has told us, in God's word it tells us, the most important thing we can do as his people, as his followers, is to do this: to love God and to love people. All right, love God and love people. That is the most important commandment that we've been given. And if you were here last week, then you got to hear Daryl kind of listen to that first part about what it really means to love God, right? To love the Lord your God with all of your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, and with all your strength. All right, Daryl did an incredible job kind of breaking down what that means. And I would encourage you, if you weren't here, if you didn't get to hear that message, man, go back and check that out. You can find it on our website. You can go there and you can see the message and kind of listen to it. And I'd really encourage you to do that if you haven't yet, because it's really, really good stuff. But this morning, we're going to kind of jump into the second part of that, all right? What it really means to love people, all right? What it really means to love people. And here's what I want you to understand is this is not a separate command, all right? This is 2 parts of the same command. So what that means is you can't try to do the first one without doing the second one, all right? You can't try to love God without really loving people, because loving people is just what it looks like to really love God. All right, and so this morning we're going to look in Luke chapter 10, all right, where Jesus tells us a story that's all about what it really means to love people. That when he says to love your neighbor, this is what he's really talking about. And here's the thing, when Jesus says this, he says it's not just loving people, but it's loving people that are really different from you. It's loving people that you have nothing in common with. It's loving people that disagree with you. And so if you want to do like a spiritual health check, all right, if you want to see how you're really doing in your heart, if you want to see how you're really doing in your relationship with God, if you want to really check on your spiritual health, then here's what you can do, all right? You can ask yourself this question: how well do I love people who are hard to like? How well do I love people who are hard to like? Those people who are really different from you. Those people who don't have the same beliefs that you have. Those people that disagree with you all the time. How well do you love those people? Now, Jesus says to do this, but we can all agree that this is really hard to do, right? Like, this is not easy because people are really difficult. We all know that, all right? As a matter of fact, at both of our campuses here and over at Lagodi, I want you to raise your hand if you know any difficult people. All right, anybody know any of those? Just any difficult people? Yeah, right? Like everybody has their hand in the air. I'm sure over at Lagodi, you guys, everybody's got their hands up because we all know some really difficult people. How many of you rode to church this morning with those people, right? You don't, all right, you don't have to raise your hands for that one, right? Definitely, like some of you are pointing, don't point, okay? This is a message about loving people, and I've just divided the whole room, all right? It's my bad. That's on me, okay? Should have known better. All right, but we all know really difficult people, right? We know this. And it's easy to see what a problem this is for our culture. It's easy to see what a problem this is for our country because all you have to do is turn on the TV, right? You can pick any news channel you want and you can immediately see how difficult it is for us to love people that disagree with us, right? This is a really difficult thing. And we disagree on things like politics and who you voted for. We have differences when it comes to our racial differences. We have differences when it comes to geographic differences and where people live and social differences and what class you fall into. We're divided on so many different things that it makes it really hard for us to love people that are different than us. And see, we get this idea, like we preach all the time, we talk all the time in our culture about what it means to love people that are different. We say we need to have tolerance and we need to be accepting of people of different views, and we talk about how good that is. But when it comes to our behavior, it's actually really different, right? Our behavior says something completely opposite of that. Because when you look at our behavior, it says that, well, if you disagree with me, then you must not care about me, right? If you don't understand me, then it must mean that we can't be friends, we can't be in a relationship together. If you don't think the same way that I think, it must mean that you don't love me. All right, but Jesus says that is 100% not true. In fact, it's the reason that the greatest commandment of all time is all about love. Because love should be the calling card of the church. It should be the most important thing about God's people. That means it's more important than our theology, and it's more important than the things that we know in our head and we understand in our mind, that the way that we love each other is the most important thing about the church, and it's about the most important thing about God's people. That's why Jesus said that people will recognize that you are my disciples if you do this, right? If you love one another. This is the most important thing that we can do. In fact, you are never more like Jesus than when you love someone who is different from you. When you're willing to sacrifice for people you have nothing in common with, when you're willing to be uncomfortable around people you don't really understand, when you're willing to love people who are different from you, you are never more like Jesus. And this morning, we're going to dive into a story. It's in Luke chapter 10, and it starts in verse 25, where Jesus is having a conversation with a religious leader. And as he goes through this, he really shows us what it means to love people who are different from us. And here's how it starts. It says, verse 25, one day an expert in religious law stood up to test Jesus by asking him this question. It says, teacher, what should I do to inherit eternal life? That's a really good question, right? What do I have to do to inherit eternal life? But it says that this guy is an expert in religious law. All right, now what that means is that he is really, really smart. All right, he's really, really educated, and he had dedicated his entire life to studying the Jewish law. That's the first 5 books of our Old Testament. It's known as the Torah. That's Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, right? His whole life was about knowing and studying these books and these laws, and he knew them really well. He knew those 5 books inside and out. And in fact, someone that would be known as an expert in the law had memorized those 5 books word for word. Like he knew every single word in Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. A really smart, really educated guy. And it says that he had come to test Jesus. But the truth is he had really come to trap Jesus. You see, his whole life was dedicated to knowing the law. He took it really seriously. And Jesus' whole life had been dedicated to sinners who disobeyed the law. And so to him, he wanted to expose Jesus as someone who really didn't take the law seriously, as someone who really didn't take the word of God seriously. And so he expected, when he asked Jesus this question, that Jesus would respond by saying, well, the law's not really important, right? These laws of God don't really matter. In fact, it doesn't matter how you live or what you do or how you behave. God will accept you no matter what. That's what he expected Jesus to say, but Jesus doesn't do that. See, Jesus is really smart. And this is a classic Jesus move that rather than answer his question the way that he expects or any other way, Jesus responds by asking another question. So look at verse 26. Jesus replied, he says, well, what does the law of Moses say, and how do you read it? And so basically he says, man, just tell me what you think. Like, I want to hear your opinion on this. You're a religious expert. Like, what do you think the most important law is? And so the guy really only has 2 options. All right, number 1, he can respond by reciting all 613 Old Testament Jewish laws. That would be a lot, all right? And his other option is that he can give a summary. All right, he's an expert in the law. He knows it well. He could summarize all of them. And that's what he chooses to do, just as Jesus predicted that he would do. He knew this is how the guy would respond. And he summarizes them by quoting Moses. He quotes straight from Leviticus and Deuteronomy. And he says this, the man answered, you must love the Lord your God with all of your heart, all your soul, all your strength, and all your mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. Right, Jesus said, do this and you will live, you will have eternal life. And Jesus is pretty much like, good job, man. Like, you nailed it. That's exactly right. All you have to do is perfectly love God and perfectly love people, and then you will be saved, right? Pretty simple. Jesus is like, all you have to do is be perfect. I'm Jesus and I do it every day, right? Like, no big deal. Anybody can do this. And yeah, at this point, the guy's like, well, that's impossible. And I'm sure he's getting a little bit frustrated, like the way that Jesus is answering, kind of putting him on the spot. He's probably a little bit embarrassed because he came here to expose Jesus, and now all of a sudden it's flipped around and he's the one that's getting exposed in front of all of his friends, in front of all of his peers right here in public. Like, he's the one that's kind of getting called out. And so he does what a lot of us do, right? When we get called out, when we get exposed, when we get a little bit embarrassed, he tries to justify himself. And so verse 29, it says, the man wanting to justify his actions, he asked Jesus, so who is my neighbor? So who's my neighbor? That's another great question that he asked, but really what he's getting at is he's asking, how can we make this a little bit easier? Like, Jesus, how can we make this doable? Because surely you don't mean to really love anyone, right? Surely you don't mean that just anyone could be my neighbor. You see, in his mind, as an educated Jewish man in this day, as a religious leader, his neighbor would have been someone who was like him, someone who thought like him, who looked like him, who acted like him, somebody who believed like him, somebody that had the same lifestyle as him. That would have been his neighbor. And what he's saying is that, Jesus, if that's who my neighbor is, like, if it's people that are like me, then maybe I could get on board with this. Like, that sounds a little bit more doable. That sounds a little bit more possible. So, Jesus, tell me, who is my neighbor? And Jesus responds by telling us this story. He jumps in verse 30 of chapter 10. It says, Jesus replied with a story. So there was a Jewish man traveling from Jerusalem down to Jericho. And he was attacked by bandits. They stripped him of his clothes, they beat him up, and they left him half dead beside the road. So Jesus starts telling them this story, and here's the thing. This is a made-up story, all right? But the situation he's describing is very, very real. And what I mean by that is, like, the road he's talking about, Jericho Road, is a real road. It really exists. It existed then and people used it, and it still exists today. And so you could go there and check it out if you wanted to. There's a real place, the Jericho Road. And the situation he describes would have been pretty common along the stretch. Right? So everyone listening, like, Jesus knew as soon as he mentioned this road, they would have immediately recognized it, like, well, yeah, this makes sense. Like, that could actually happen. It would be like if today I told you guys that there was a man traveling down the interstate near Bloomington, and he got stuck in traffic because there was construction, right? Like, we all go, well, yeah, of course, like, that happens there, because we all know, like, in week 1, God created the entire world, and in week 2, they shut down a lane of traffic in Bloomington. Like, been that way ever since, all right? Like, we all understand, like, that story would make perfect sense. Well, when Jesus talks about a man traveling down Jericho Road that gets attacked by bandits, they would have been like, yeah, of course. Because in fact, there was a section of the road that was known as the Pass of Blood, all right, very ominous. And it's ominous for a reason, because it was really common that during this little stretch, the Pass of Blood, that people would be attacked. There were bandits that would be around there were outlaws, and they would come and attack people and rob them and leave them for dead. Especially a Jewish man being attacked by Samaritan bandits. You see, Jews and Samaritans hated each other. There was a lot of racial tension there, and it went back to years and years and years before Jesus is telling this story. And the reason is because way back in that day, way back before this, there was a group of people known as the Assyrians, all right, a foreign army, and they had invaded Israel. And so as they invaded Israel, they came all the way down. They were coming in from the north, and they made it about halfway down, but then they got stopped. And so they ended up settling just in the northern territory of Israel, and this happened to be where Samaria was. And so after they settled there, and they're around for several years, and they begin to intermarry with the people in Samaria, and after a few generations pass by, like all of a sudden, there's no longer any pure-blooded Jews in Samaria. So Samaritans are now a mixed race. And they were looked down upon by Jewish people, and Jewish people hated them. And since Jewish people hated the Samaritans, in return, the Samaritans hated them. And so they were constantly rivals. They were constantly arguing. They disagreed on everything. And so when you said a Jewish man got attacked by a group of Samaritans down the Pass of Blood on Jericho Road, everyone listening to the story would have been like, yeah, that makes perfect sense. Something like this happened all the time. And so we leave this man lying in the ditch, kind of bleeding out. As we continue our story in verse 31 and 32, it says, by chance, a priest comes along. And when he saw the man lying there, he crossed to the other side of the road and passed by him. And then a temple assistant walks over and he looks at him lying there, but he also passes by on the other side. Now, we have our first two guys that kind of show up on the scene, right? You've got a priest, and this first guy, like he would have been sort of like the pastor of a church. That's what a priest would have been. And so you think for sure a pastor of a church, like this is a religious guy, and he would have been Jewish, so he's very similar. He's the same as the guy that's lying here in the ditch. Like surely if anyone is going to help this man who's been attacked, it's going to be the priest, right? It's going to be the religious guy. But it says instead, he crosses the street, right? He gets as far away from whatever happened there as he can, and he goes around the situation and leaves the man kind of lying in the ditch. Well, next up, we have a temple assistant. All right, and a temple assistant would have been sort of like a Bible college student, like he's still in training and understudy, trying to become a priest. And so there's a really good chance, like he could have been the intern of the priest that just came ahead of him. And so he comes upon this Jewish man lying in the ditch, and very similar, they're both Jewish people. You would think he would help someone. He's young and ambitious. He's supposed to be, this religious person. But he does the same thing. It says that he passes by on the other side, and he goes around. He leaves the man lying there for dead. Now, what's really sad is that both of these guys, being religious people, they were probably on their way to some sort of religious event, right? They were on their way to a church service. And they were in such a hurry to get to this church service, such a hurry to get to whatever it was that was going on, they didn't have time to really love the man that needed them in the moment. It says they both went around. And to be fair, when they did this, it was also a little bit because they were really afraid, right? Because if you see someone who's just been attacked and they've just been left for dead and robbed on the side of the road, but they're not quite dead yet, what that means is that whoever was responsible for this probably isn't too far away. So they knew if they chose to go and help this man, they'd be putting themselves in danger, right? They themselves could then be robbed. They themselves could then be attacked, and they might find themselves in the same situation as this guy lying half dead in a ditch on the side of the road. And so they choose to play it safe, and they just go around. Well, as we keep reading, now we get to kind of the shocking part of the story. All right, verse 33 through 35. It says, then a despised Samaritan comes along. And when he saw the man, he felt compassion for him. And so going over to him, the Samaritan soothed his wounds with olive oil and wine, and he bandaged them. And then he put the man on his own donkey, and he took him to an inn, where he took care of him. Then the next day he handed the innkeeper 2 silver coins, and he said to him, take care of this man. If his bill runs higher than this, then I'll pay you the next time that I'm here. See, of all people, it's a despised Samaritan who comes to the aid of the man who's in need. Right? It wasn't the religious people, right? It wasn't the priest and it wasn't the temple assistant. It wasn't the guys who were like him who were both Jewish. It was the Samaritan. Now remember, Samaritans and Jews were enemies. They had nothing in common. Right? When it came to racial issues, they were enemies. Political issues, they were enemies. Religious issues, they were on the other side of the aisle from each other. These guys were enemies in every sense of the word. But when he saw this man in need, he put all of the enemy stuff to the side and he had compassion for him. He loved him. And he goes over to the Jewish man on the side of the road and he bandages his wounds, right? Putting himself at risk. He could be attacked. He could be robbed in the same way, but he doesn't care. He goes over, he bandages his wounds. He puts him on his own donkey and he takes him to an inn. And then it says the next day, he's still with him. He stayed with him a whole day, which means that whatever was going on in his life, whatever was important, whatever he was on his way to, he decided that this man's need was more important than whatever he had going on. He puts everything on hold to care for him a whole extra day. And then he goes to the innkeeper. He hands him his credit card and he says, hey, whatever he needs, just charge it to me. I want you to make sure that this man is okay. See, Jesus says that this is what real love looks like. This is what it means to love someone who is different from you, to love someone who has nothing in common with you, that you go and you sacrifice, that you go and you put yourself out, that you go and you make time for people who are nothing like you. That's the kind of love that Jesus calls us to have. It's love without limits. And I want us to highlight 3 different things that we can kind of learn from this that we can take away, all right? And here's the first one, is that love does not put limits on who. Right, love doesn't put limits on who, and that means that, it's easy for us to want to help people who are like us, right? People that we have things in common with, people that we understand, people that have the same beliefs as us. But Jesus says you can't put limits on who. So if you look back at our story, the 2 main characters are a Jewish man and a Samaritan man, right? And like we've said over and over, these people were enemies. They hated each other. They had nothing in common. But love doesn't put limits on who. So when the Samaritan man comes to him, he loves him in the way that Jesus has loved us, right? He puts everything else to the side because love doesn't put limits on who. When you see someone in need, when you see someone who's different, that means anyone. That person is your neighbor. That's the person that Jesus is calling us to love because love doesn't put limits on who. So here's the second thing is love doesn't put limits on when. See, I know for a lot of us, we look at people and we ask the question, when should I help? Right? When should I help someone who's in need? Because if you're anything like me, and I'm guilty of this, we've all done this, you've maybe seen someone on a street corner that needs money or is begging for money or needs a lunch, and you ask yourself, how do I really know what they're going to do with this money? Right? Like, how do I really know that I should help them? Like, how do I really know that they deserve it? Because when we see someone who's in need and like maybe their house is burned down, right? If you've ever seen a situation like that, or maybe they've encountered some sort of flood that's wiped out a lot of what they own, for sure we want to help those people, right? Because we understand, like when someone's house burns down or a flood comes in, just a natural disaster, that's completely out of their hands. There's nothing they can do about that. That could happen to anyone. That could happen to me. And so I understand their need. It's not their fault. But there's other situations where I look at them and I wonder, do they really deserve to be helped? Because it seems like maybe they're in a terrible situation because they made terrible choices, right? Like maybe they brought this on themselves. Maybe it's because they were reckless and they were careless and they were irresponsible. And maybe it's because really they just made some dumb choices. They made really poor choices and they brought this on themselves. You see, I think that's the way a lot of us view this, the way I'm guilty of viewing this sometimes. But the truth is that no 2 people would have thought the other person deserved it more than Jews and Samaritans. But they didn't let that stop them from being a neighbor to the man in need, right? The Samaritan still loved him. And I want you to think about this. What if Jesus had looked down from heaven and said, you know what, I'm only going to come and save people who really deserve it? Well, he could have saved himself the trip, right? Because none of us deserve to be saved. But love doesn't put limits on when we deserve it. See, that's not what grace is. Jesus came anyway. Here's the third thing, all right? Love doesn't put limits on how much. Because I know a lot of us sometimes will look at a situation, we know we can see the need, we know that somebody needs help, but we think, well, I can't really afford to help. I mean, if I were to win the lottery, I have $100 million, I would be so generous. I'd be the most generous person you knew if that were to happen. But the truth is sometimes I look at things and I think, well, I can't really afford to help in the way that they need to help. I can't really afford the money and I can't really afford the time and I can't really afford what they need to fix the situation. See, I think when we think that way, we have the same mindset as the priest and the temple assistant, right? They wanted to help, but they really couldn't afford the risk. That if they were willing to go over and be near this man, they'd be risking danger, right? They could get robbed just like he was robbed. They'd be risking money, that they could get robbed like that, and that they would have to pay for all of his medical needs and what he needed to get better. Like they would be risking all of that. And so they decided they really couldn't afford the risk. But as the Samaritan comes, he takes on all the risk, right? He's willing to risk social outcast, that his reputation would have been at stake for helping someone of a different race. He was willing to risk the danger that he could be attacked just like this man was attacked. And he was willing to risk his own money, that he went and laid everything out and said, charge it to me, whatever he needs. See, he was willing to risk everything. And I love what it says in Galatians chapter 6, verse 2 and 3. It says that we are to share each other's burdens. In this way, you obey the law of Christ. If you think you are too important to help someone, you're only fooling yourself. You're not that important. See, what that means is that we are to share each other's burdens. That means that we sacrifice. That's what love does, it sacrifices. That means that sometimes you buy someone's lunch, even if it means that you have to skip dinner. And I know a lot of times when I say I can't afford to help, what I really mean is I can't afford to help without sacrificing my own standard of life. Right? I can't afford to help without sacrificing my own comfort. But that's exactly the kind of love that Jesus is calling us to. It's love that sacrifices. It's love that doesn't put limits on how much we can give. That's the kind of love that Jesus calls us to. So when we love like this, when we love without limits, we don't put limits on when, and we don't put limits on who, and we don't put limits on how much. Even when it's somebody's fault, even when they put this burden on themselves, we still love them because that is the way that Jesus has loved us. Right now, that's incredible. When you look at that kind of life, when you look at that kind of love, if you were to really live that out, that would be amazing. But who actually lives this way? Who actually has that kind of life? Because we can all agree, like having that kind of neighbor, that would be awesome, right? Like who wouldn't want to live in a neighborhood with people who really live that out? That would really love you in this way. How do we actually do that? Well, see, here's the thing. To me, it's really interesting that Jesus tells the story kind of backwards from the way that I would, right? If you had a Jewish man, an expert in the law, and he came to me and he asked me that question. He said, who is my neighbor? And I were going to explain it to him. See, I would tell the story like this. I would flip the Jewish man and the Samaritan man. I would put the man I'm talking to, the Jewish man, I would put him on the saddle, riding along down the road, and I would say, you're riding along and you come across your enemy, a Samaritan. He's been attacked and left for dead on the side of the road. Here's what you should do. You should love your enemy, right? You should love other people, and so you should get off your donkey, you should get down, you should bandage his wounds, you should take care of his needs, you should make sure that he's okay. In this way, you should love your enemy. Now go and do likewise. That's the way that I would have told the story. And it's really similar, right? It's really close to the same thing that Jesus said. It's the same principle that you should love other people, even people that are different. But here's the thing. When you're the one on the horse and you're helping someone else in need, your enemy there, then all you're doing is giving someone a rule. You're just giving them guilt. You're saying, look how much you have and look how little they have. You should help them. See, it's the same principle, but it's really a little bit different because rules don't change people's lives. And Jesus knew this. He knew that if he told it that way, it would get in the man's mind, right? He would understand in his head, but it would never make it down into his heart. And so instead, when Jesus told the story, he put the man listening as the one lying in the ditch, bleeding out. And he said, when you're lying there, in your darkest hour, when your life is bleeding out before you and your enemy comes along, the person you despise the most, the person who disagrees with you, the person you have nothing in common with, when your enemy comes along, what do you want that person to do for you in that moment? Because when you think of it like that, that's when it begins to change your life. And so for us this morning, if we ask that question, all right, who is your enemy? Who is the person, if you were bleeding out in a ditch, who would be the last person you would want to walk up? Who would be the person you disagree with, the person you are most uncomfortable around, the person that you have nothing in common with, that don't have the same beliefs with? Who is that person? Because that is exactly who Jesus would put in the story with you. That is exactly who Jesus is calling you to love, because that is exactly how Jesus has loved us. You see, what Jesus wants us to understand is that in this story of the Good Samaritan, Jesus is the Samaritan. And we are the ones that are bleeding out in a ditch. But here's the thing, Jesus didn't walk by you. Jesus didn't leave you there. Jesus came to meet your needs when nothing else could meet them. He came to you in your moment of weakness and your sin and your disparity. Jesus came and he loved you. And he did it at great sacrifice to himself. He knew that it was going to be dangerous. He knew that it was going to be risky. And that means not just risking his life, but he was willing to give his life to save yours. 1 Peter tells us that it's by his wounds that we have been healed. See, that's the love that Jesus has shown us. That when we were bleeding out in a ditch, he came to rescue us. And it's only when we understand that, all right? It's only when we see ourselves in that role that we can begin to live out the great commandment. It's only then that we can begin to understand what it means to really love people. And that's why I love the way that Jesus kind of wraps this up when he's ending the story. He kind of reverses again. You remember how he flipped the question in the beginning? Well, he does a similar thing here as he kind of reverses it again. Look what he asks. After he gets done telling the story, he turns to the man. And in verse 35 and 37, it says this. Now, which of these three would you say was a neighbor to the man who was attacked by bandits? Jesus asked him this question, and the man replied, the one who showed him mercy. And Jesus said, yes, now go and do the same. Now you see what Jesus did? This is really, really brilliant. See, in the beginning, the man came to Jesus and he said, who is my neighbor? But in the end, Jesus turns to him and he says, who has been neighbor to you? Who has been neighbor to you? See, what he wants him to see is that when you are the one bleeding out in a ditch, when you are the one who is hopeless, Jesus was neighbor to you. When you understand that, when you see that God has not given us a rule to follow, God has given us his son to follow, his son as an example, that Jesus came to rescue you when he owed you nothing but rejection. Scripture says that while we were still sinners, while we were still enemies, then Christ came and died for you. That is the love that we have been shown. See, it's only when we understand that we can begin to love other people. Because here's the thing, all right? The love that Jesus demands from us is impossible to give until you have received it. And what that means is that the way you understand your own salvation will determine the way that you love other people. So here's the deal. If you only think that you have been saved a little bit, then you will only love a little bit, right? If you don't think you've been saved from much, you will not love much. If you only think you've required a little bit of grace, then you'll only show a little bit of grace to other people. And if you think that you've only had a little bit of the kindness of God, he's only been a little kind to you, then you'll only be a little bit kind to other people. But see, when we start to see the magnitude of what Jesus has done for us, the cost that Jesus paid for us, what he went through in order to save us and to rescue us from our own sin and hopelessness, man, then that changes everything. When we start to see ourselves as fully dependent on the cross of Christ for our salvation, we start to see ourselves as fully dependent on grace to go to heaven. We start to see ourselves as fully experiencing the kindness of God. Then we can begin to fully love other people. And here's the thing, all right, I'll close with this thought. What would it look like if our church really started to live that out? What if we really started as individuals to love people who were different from us? People who had different beliefs, people who disagreed with you, people you have nothing in common with. What if we really started to love them? What would that look like at your workplace? And what would that look like at your schools when we go back in the fall, students? What would that look like in our community here and over in Lagodi if we really started to love people in a sacrificial way that Jesus has called us to love, in the same way that he has loved us? That, man, people would be blown away, that they would recognize the church in the way that Jesus meant it to be recognized is something so radically different that people can't help but take notice and can't help but ask the question about what is the gospel, just so they can get an answer for why in the world do these people live and love the way that they do. Man, that's the kind of impact that this could have, that it would reach people who are far from God, because we would love people who have nothing in common with God, nothing in common with us. That's the love we're called to. Let's pray.